But for the rest of us, we're going to continue our study through the Gospel of Mark. And so if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, would you open with me to Mark chapter 1? And as you're turning there, for most of human history, sickness has been one of the most frightening realities of everyday life. In the ancient world, illnesses were often unpredictable and often deadly. Think about it. There were no antibiotics at the time. There were no hospitals, or at least as we know them, no reliable treatments. A fever could turn serious overnight. A lingering infection could become long-term suffering or even death. When sickness entered a home, it brought with it fear, right? There was fear of loss, fear of contagion, fear of helplessness. And it's in those moments where there was very little anyone could do. Again, doctors were limited, the remedies uncertain. Once illness took hold, people learned very quickly how fragile life was and how little control they actually had. And that's the world that Mark is writing into. You see, up to this point in Mark's gospel, we've seen Jesus speak with authority in public. We've watched him confront evil openly within the synagogue. And now Mark is going to take us into some more intimate settings. He's going to take us into a home with a woman who's bedridden with fever. To crowds who come to gather around a single doorway. To a man whose disease has made him untouchable. And in each of these scenes, Mark shows us not just what Jesus can do, but how he uses his authority. You see, in this passage this morning, we are invited to behold a king whose authority reaches into our illness, whose mission is governed by prayer, and who is able to overcome uncleanness. And as Mark unfolds these moments, he presses into us not just to see more about who Jesus is, but to answer the question, how will we respond to him? So Mark chapter 1, we're starting in verse 29. If you're with me, say word. All right, let's get into it. And immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever, and immediately they told him about her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her, and she began to serve him. That evening at sundown they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons, and the whole city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases and cast out many demons, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. The first thing I want us to see this morning, church, is we need to see the king's authority over illness. The king's authority over illness. Look at verse 29. It says, immediately he left the synagogue. Right? Remember, he was in the synagogue. He had just cast out the demon from the demon-possessed man. Now he leaves the synagogue, and he goes to the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. What Mark wants us to see is there's no pause between worship and real life. Jesus moves straight from the synagogue into a home, right? From public ministry into private need. And that tells us something important, right? That Jesus' authority wasn't limited to simple religious spaces, but it followed him even into the ordinary places, into family situations, everyday life's problems. And so he enters this home, and as they enter, verse 30 says, now Simon's mother-in-law lay ill with a fever. And immediately they told him, that's Jesus, about her. And again, this is not quite the dramatic situation, right? There's no demon here, at least that we know of. All right, there's no big moral failing that Jesus is addressing. He's not standing in front of the crowds at the synagogue. It's just a fever. It's just a sickness. But in the first century, again, a fever wasn't a minor inconvenience. It could turn serious quickly, right? Illness meant vulnerability. It was uncertainty. And this is where Jesus steps in, right? Verse 31, it says, and he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and the fever left her. Right? He just takes her by the hand, pulls her up. There's no buildup, right? There's no big sort of dramatic happening. Jesus just reaches over and touches her, and the sickness is gone. Mark is teaching us something about authority. That real authority over the physical weakness of our human bodies. And he says that what's the result here? That as Jesus heals her, how does she respond? It says she began to serve them. Right? That line there, we shouldn't just glance over that line, right? Mark isn't making a statement about roles, but he's showing us that the completeness of the healing that Jesus gave. Right? This woman is not left weak after Jesus heals her. She's not slowly improving. She's fully restored. Jesus' authority doesn't just ease our symptoms, but it can bring people back into life, back into wholeness. In verse 32, it says that evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. Remember, the Sabbath is over at this point. Word is spread throughout the city. The city knows where Jesus is. In verse 33, it adds the whole city now is gathered together at the door. I mean, can you picture the scene here? You got sick people gathered all around, desperate families, just broken people lining up outside this small house. The door becomes the meeting place between human need and divine authority. In verse 34, what does Jesus do? It says he healed many who were sick of various diseases, and he cast out many demons. Again, Mark doesn't try to catalog all the different illnesses that Jesus healed. He doesn't slow down to tell the story of every person, although you can imagine there was a story to every person who came to that door. His point is bigger than that. It's that sickness in all of its forms falls underneath the authority of Jesus. Whether obvious or hidden, whether sudden or chronic, whether severe or familiar, none of it was beyond his reach. And then Mark adds another little detail here. He says, and he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Again, another little detail. I mean, the demon in the synagogue, he knew who Jesus was. He says, I know who you are. And here, Jesus says, they know who I am. Church, do we know more than the demons? That's a question for us to wrestle with. Not just do you know about Jesus, but do you believe in him? Have you surrendered to him? Is he your Lord? He says he would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. It's interesting, even in the middle of this moment of compassion, Jesus is still in control, right? He's healing freely, but he's governing this moment very carefully. He's not going to accept testimony, even true testimony, because what the demons declare about Jesus would have been true. But he wasn't going to accept testimony from unclean sources. He was not going to allow just the public spectacle or pressure to identify him. His authority was not reactive, it was deliberate. And Mark is teaching us something important, that the king's authority over illness is real. It is immediate, but it is not separated from his mission. Right? Jesus does not become a miracle worker at the mercy of human demand. He is the king who heals because he has authority, and he exercises that authority with a purpose. Right? This passage assures us that sickness is not outside of Christ's rule. Right? So our weakness, our frailty, our own physical limits, all of that lies within the reach of his authority. But Mark is also setting us up for the tension that comes next, which is the crowds that want Jesus to stay. They want him to stay. The crowds, they want to keep Jesus. Well, why wouldn't you? He can heal you at a touch. They want him to keep healing. They want him to keep meeting their needs. And Jesus will insist that there's a something greater. There's a greater need. But what we have to see here initially is that the king has authority over illness, but his mission is larger than simply bringing people relief. He has authority over the illness, but he has a greater mission than just bringing physical comfort and relief. Again, most of us know the difference between care and authority when it comes to sickness. Right? You can be sitting in a hospital and you can have somebody who cares deeply about you when you're sick. Someone who brings you food, who checks in, who sits beside the bed. And that matters, right? We're not going to downplay that. That's important. Compassion matters. But no amount of care can actually make the illness leave. And then there are moments when a doctor walks in the room and he looks at the chart and he says, this is what's wrong. This is what we're going to do. Right? There's no guessing now. There's no uncertainty. They're able to speak with clarity because they know exactly what they're dealing with. Now imagine how different it would be if the doctor didn't just prescribe a treatment, but he simply spoke a word and the sickness was gone. Like, that's what we see here in this passage, that when Jesus takes Peter's mother-in-law by the hand, when he lifts her up, he's not offering her comfort. He's not hoping for improvement. He's not just giving her sympathy. He is acting with authority. The fever does not gradually subside, it leaves. What Mark shows us is that Jesus doesn't just care about suffering, but he commands it. The sickness obeys him. The weakness yields to him. The same authority that silenced demons reaches into ordinary human frailty and restores it. And so what does this mean for you and I? What should we walk away from understanding the authority that the king has over illness? Well, for one, church, this ought to let us know that you can bring your physical weakness to Jesus. You can bring your own physical weakness to Christ. Mark shows us that sickness is not outside the authority of Christ, and it's not outside the concern of Christ. Right? The action step here is for you and I to stop treating prayer as our last resort. If you are dealing with illness, your own or someone else's, name it before the Lord. Pray about it specifically. Ask God for healing. Ask him for strength. Ask him for endurance. Bring your weakness to Jesus because, not because you're desperate, but because he has authority over it. Secondly, church, we ought to approach Jesus with confidence in both his compassion and his power. You see, when we see Jesus here, he's not just sympathetic, but he is powerful, right? He's authoritative. The action step for us is to come to Christ without shrinking back in fear or doubt. When you pray, don't come assuming that Christ is going to be unwilling to do anything about your situation or that he's going to be indifferent to your pain. When you pray, come believing the King who touches the sick and who is both willing to help and to heal. Third, we ought to allow Christ's work in our life to move us toward faithful living. You see, Peter's mother-in-law was healed, and what does she do? Immediately she returns to life and service. Right, the action step for you and I is to ask, how has Christ restored or sustained me so that I might faithfully live under his reign? Right, Christ never just restores us to restore us, but he restores us with a purpose. Right, our lives are not our own. Instead of asking how God's work draws attention to you, ask how it reorients you toward obedience, how it reorients you towards gratitude and service. Fourth, we ought to bring ordinary, everyday needs before Jesus without hesitation. Remember, where did this healing take place? It wasn't in the synagogue. It was in a home. The action step is to stop compartmentalizing your life. Bring your totality of your life before the Father. Bring family concerns. Bring daily pressures. Bring your fatigue. Bring your small struggles, all of it to Christ in prayer. Right? Nothing in your life is too ordinary to fall outside the scope of the King's authority. His authority over illness does not promise you ease, but it does promise you his care. Our response is to trust him, to bring our weakness to him, and to live faithfully under his reign. So I want you to see the authority of the king over illness this morning, church. And secondly, I want you to see the king's prayer-powered mission. See his prayer-powered mission. Look at verse 35. Mark says, "And rising very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he," that's Jesus, "departed and went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. And Simon and those who were with him searched for him. And they found him and said to him, 'Everyone is looking for you.' And he said to them, 'Let us go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out.' And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons." And so again, we have to get the context here. I mean, this is after an exhausting day and night for Jesus, right after he's been performing healing after healing, and the crowds have been pressing in and gathering all around this home. Mark tells us in verse 35 that essentially the very next thing Jesus does is rising very early in the morning, while it's still dark, he departed, went out to a desolate place, and there he prayed. Now, if there was anyone who had an excuse to sleep in, it was Jesus. Right? I mean, if anyone had reason to stay close to the crowds, it was Jesus. Everybody wanted more of what he had just done. They were looking for him. But instead of staying, he leaves. Right? Instead of capitalizing on the momentum of the situation, he pulls back. He listens to not the crowd, but to the Father. And Mark piles up the details here. He's trying to help us see. He doesn't want us to miss the point, right? Jesus gets up early. It's still dark. He goes somewhere quiet and alone, right? This was not a rushed plan. This was very methodical, very planned out. Prayer is where he wanted to begin his day. Verse 36 says, "Simon and those who were with him searched for him." Again, that word searched, there's a urgency behind it. They were looking for him. They were worried about him. I mean, from their perspective, Jesus is missing this golden opportunity that the crowds have come. They tell him in verse 37, "Everyone's looking for you." All right, that's good news, right? People want Jesus. We're big time. The crowds are back. The demand hasn't slowed down, but Jesus doesn't respond the way that we expect him. He says to them, let's go somewhere else, right? Verse 38, "Let's go on to the next towns, that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out." In other words, Jesus says, I know they want me to stay. I know the crowds have gathered. But there's more important things for me to do. There's more places I need to go. We're not staying, we're moving on. He doesn't say the healing was unimportant. He doesn't say the people didn't matter, but he does say that there was something more pressing, and reminds them of why he came. His mission was not driven by popularity or need. It was shaped by the will of his Father. You see, the crowds wanted more miracles, but Jesus wanted more preaching. Because miracles can draw the crowd, but only the word can change hearts. Healing can relieve suffering for a moment, but the gospel brings lasting transformation. And here's what we need to see, is that this clarity doesn't come from pressure from the crowds. This clarity of mind for Jesus came as he sought a desolate place to be alone and to speak with the Father. Jesus doesn't emerge from that moment deciding his mission on the fly, but he emerges from that moment with direction. He knows it's time to move on. So in verse 39 it says, "And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons." Jesus moves forward. He moves forward, but he stays focused. He goes town to town, synagogue to synagogue, always proclaiming the kingdom, always confronting evil, doing exactly what he said he came to do. And Mark is teaching us that something here, that the king's authority over illness, it doesn't allow it doesn't mean that he gets caught up in only treating that thing. Just because he has authority over illness doesn't mean that his authority to treat the illness trumps the mission for why he came. Compassion was good, right? But compassion and success did not define his mission. Jesus sought prayer. He sought intimacy with the Father. He allowed the Father's will to guide and shape what he did and where he went. That's obedience, right? This is the king who is governing his own mission through prayer. And again, most of us know what it's like to be needed by someone, right? Maybe you got family and kids and responsibilities, and the messages at work, they keep coming. The requests for you don't slow down. Everything feels urgent. And a lot of times these urgent things that are pressing in on us, they're also good things. Right? There's people who want help. There's people who need answers. There's people who want your time. But the danger is in allowing those moments of urgency to define your direction. Right? A leader who responds to every demand isn't really leading, he's reacting. And so the mission begins to slowly get reshaped by whoever speaks the loudest or needs the most. And that's exactly the pressure that Jesus faces here. Is the crowds are waiting. The disciples are saying, everyone's looking for you. From the outside, if Jesus were to stay there, that would have felt like a success. But Jesus steps away to pray. Not because he doesn't care, but because he does. Prayer is where the noise quiets and where his purpose and mission come back into focus. And when he returns, he knows exactly what to do next. The king refuses to let the demand of the crowds determine his direction. He listens to the Father first, and then he moves forward. So what can we learn from this church? What do we take away from seeing the king's mission powered by prayer? First, I would say it means that you and I ought to slow down long enough to evaluate what is driving our own obedience. Right? Evaluate what is driving your obedience. Not every urgent request is a divine assignment. The action step here is to take a moment and pause before automatically saying yes. Right? Maybe this week even ask yourself, am I doing this thing because God has clearly led me, or because I feel pressured or needed, or I'm afraid to disappoint? Faithfulness begins with discernment, not urgency. Secondly, we need to reestablish prayer as the place we go for direction. Jesus prays before he moves forward. Not in the midst of the situation, not as he's being overwhelmed by the crowds. He sets aside intentional, uninterrupted time to pray, to be alone with God before making decisions of where to go next. If prayer has become something that you fit in when time allows, it's time for you to intentionally reverse that order. Let prayer shape your direction rather than react to the pressures of life. Third, we need to redefine success by faithfulness rather than visible results. You see, the disciples see crowds and they see the demand as the success, but Jesus sees obedience to the Father's mission as success. And so the action step for us is to ask ourselves, how do we measure fruitfulness? Am I encouraged or discouraged mainly by numbers or affirmation or outcomes, or by obedience to what God has clearly called me to do? Choose to value faithfulness even when it costs visibility or applause. Fourth, church, place your plans openly before the Lord, but hold them loosely. Place your plans openly before the Lord, but hold on to them loosely. Jesus leaves a place where he is wanted because he knows the mission is bigger than just the one moment. Maybe you need to take a moment this week, take a plan, a goal, a direction that you're confident about, and consciously just submit it to God. Say, Lord, I believe this is what you want me to do. I believe this is what you've called me to do. And I'm moving forward in that. But I'm also willing to be redirected. I'm also willing to delay, to reshape it for the sake of your purposes. Allow that confidence and those plans to be clarified by prayer. Carry it forward in obedience. You see, we can see the king this morning, that he has authority over illness, that his mission is powered by prayer. And lastly, church, I want you to see the king also has authority over uncleanness. Look at verse 40. And the leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." And moved with pity, Jesus, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once and said to him, "See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them." But he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places, and people were coming out to him from every quarter. See, Mark gives us a very important detail of this man who comes to Jesus. In verse 40, it says he was a leper. Right? A leper came to him, imploring him, kneeling, speaking to him. He says, "If you will, you can make me clean." And we got to pause for a moment, because when we hear the word leprosy, we tend to only think maybe in medical terms. But in the first century, leprosy was far more than just a skin disease, but it was a death sentence. I mean, leprosy referred to a range of skin conditions, but whatever the exact diagnosis, the result was the same, that once you were declared a leper, you were declared unclean. You were cut off from normal life and society. You were removed from worship. You were separated from your family. You were forced to live outside of the community. Lepers were required to warn others to stay away, to announce their uncleanness as they moved about. And leprosy didn't just affect the body, but it reshaped the entire person's existence. For the leper, it was a life of isolation and shame, the loss of human touch. Think about that. No handshakes, no warm embraces, no gathering together with God's people. You didn't just have leprosy, but you became the leper. So when Mark tells us that this man came to Jesus, he's showing us something amazing here, that this man is crossing social, religious, and legal boundaries. He's risking rebuke and rejection. He's putting everything on the line on the hope that Jesus might be different. And he says to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." He doesn't question Jesus' power. He's asking about his willingness. It's never a question of Jesus' power. It was, are you willing? And he doesn't ask just to be healed. He asks what? To be made clean. What he longs for is not just relief from disease, but it is restoration to worship and to community and to life. And Jesus says in verse 41, he says, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and he touched him. And he said to him, "I will be clean." I love this moment in Scripture, because Jesus doesn't choose to heal from a distance, although we very well know that he could. He could speak a word like he did for Jairus' daughter, and it would be done. But he touches him. Right? A touch that would have been shocking to this man. That according to the law, uncleanness was contagious. So to touch a leper was to become ceremonially unclean yourself. But in Jesus, something different was happening. Uncleanness does not spread to him, but cleanness flows from him. His authority reverses the direction. The king was not contaminated by brokenness, but brokenness was overcome by his presence. In verse 42, it says, and immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. Again, there's no delay. There's no recovery period. Jesus' authority over uncleanness was decisive and complete. In verse 43, Jesus then sternly charges him and sends him away at once. Right? He's issuing a strong command to do what? He tells him to go to show himself to the priest and to offer what Moses commanded. Again, Jesus is not trying to sidestep the law. He's trying to get the man to go and offer himself and do what is the fulfillment of the law. The priest doesn't heal anyone. The priest verified that somebody was healed. So Jesus sends this man back into the community through the path in which God had already established. He says, go and provide for them the proof. And so for one, the healing was not just personal for this man, but it was a testimony. It was a sign that something greater than ritual purity was present, that the king who cleanses the unclean has come. But what does the man do instead of staying silent as Jesus urged? It says in verse 45, but he went out and began to talk freely about it and to spread the news. And at first that sounds, well, you know what, I do the same thing. I can't really fault the guy. I do the same thing. It's understandable. It's grateful. It's joyful. It's sincere. But Mark shows us the result. It says that so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in desolate places. Right? And we have a contrast here, right? As this man who was on the outskirts of society is restored to society, Jesus is pushed further to the margins of society. Right? This is not an accidental reversal. Mark wants us to see the cost of Jesus' authority, that the king who touches the unclean will himself bear exclusion. He steps into the leper's place so the leper can step back into life. Mark wants us to see here also that even sincere enthusiasm can work against God's mission when it ignores obedience. The man receives cleansing, but he resists instruction. Jesus' authority over uncleanness was absolute. He cleansed what no one would touch, but his authority also demands trust and obedience, not just our gratitude. And ultimately, this scene pushes us forward because the king who is not defiled by uncleanness will one day be treated as unclean. The one who restores outsiders will himself be cast out, and he does it willingly. That's the authority exercised with sacrificial compassion. Again, most of us, we caught a small glimpse of what separation felt like in 2020. Right? There were moments when COVID was going strong, when people were sick, when loved ones couldn't be near to them, fathers were not allowed into delivery rooms, family members weren't allowed to sit beside loved ones who were passing away. Not because they didn't love them, but because contact was considered dangerous. But as painful as those moments were, most of us knew that those situations were temporary. But now imagine that separation becomes permanent for your whole life. Imagine you're always being held at a distance, always being told you're a risk, always untouchable. And that was the leper's world. And so when Jesus reaches out and touches this man, it's not just a healing, but it's a restoration of humanity. Before the disease leaves his body, Jesus gives him what he's been denied for years, a simple human touch. And he doesn't just wait for the man to be clean, but he touches him while he is still unclean. And I think it's so amazing that the king's authority over the uncleanness, it doesn't spread to him, but his holiness overcomes it. But again, that touch comes at a cost. Jesus falls back out of the community. Jesus falls towards isolation. This is what the king does. He enters into our separation so that we can be restored. He bears what keeps us away so that we can come near. Again, this is not just a compassionate moment, but this was a preview of the cross, of the one who would take on our sin, our uncleanness, and stand in our place. The one who lived the life we were meant to live, who died the death that we deserved. This is Jesus standing in our place. And so as we see this King move throughout this passage here, church, how do we respond? How do we respond to this sort of authority? Authority that illness can't deny. Authority that overcomes uncleanness. First thing I would recommend to us, church, is that you can come to Jesus honestly. You can come to Jesus honestly. Again, the leper did not wait until he was acceptable. He came to Jesus as he was. Wrong as it may have been societally, legally, he came as he was to Jesus. The action step for you and I is to stop postponing your repentance. Bring the sin, bring the shame, bring the brokenness that you've been trying to manage and keep quiet. Bring it into the light and the love of Jesus. Don't wait to feel clean. Come so that you can be made clean. Be honest. Come to Jesus honestly. Secondly, move toward obedience even when it feels uncomfortable. Jesus' holiness does not shrink away from uncleanness. It overcomes it. So for us, that means following Christ might require stepping toward difficult people. It might mean walking into costly situations rather than avoiding them. Ask yourself this week, is there someone or something that I've been keeping my distance from that obedience to Christ would call me toward? And if so, then take an intentional step in that direction. Move toward obedience, even if it feels uncomfortable. Third, listen carefully when Jesus gives clear instruction. We need to listen carefully when Jesus gives full instruction, and not just listen, but obey. Again, the man was healed, and his enthusiasm was great, but it ought not to excuse disobedience. Our action step is to stop substituting good intentions for submission to Christ. If Christ has already spoken clearly, and he has in his word, if he's spoken clearly about an area of your life, don't try to reinterpret it. Don't delay the change. Don't try to soften it. Again, we are our own best defense attorneys. But instead, do what he says when he says it. Listen carefully when Jesus gives clear instruction and obey it. Fourth, remember the cost that Jesus bore for your restoration. The leper was restored to community. Jesus was pushed into the margins. We ought to allow that to shape the way that we view our salvation. Right? Take time today, take time this week to thank Christ for what he willingly bore. Rejection and isolation and the cross so that you could be brought near to God. Remember the cost Jesus paid. And lastly, church, trust the authority that both has the power to cleanse and command. The same King who touches the unclean is the King who directs our lives. Following him means trusting that his authority is always exercised for our good, even when it leads into obedience that you and I might not naturally choose. Again, the call of this passage is not vague, it's very clear. It's come to Christ. Move toward obedience. Submit where he has spoken. And trust the King who makes the unclean clean. Again, Mark brings us through this passage with intention. We've seen the King who has authority over illness, who enters ordinary homes and meets human weakness with power and compassion. We've seen a King whose mission is governed by prayer, who refuses to let urgency or applause determine his direction. And we've seen a King who has authority over uncleanness, who touches what others avoid, and who restores what has been cast out and bears the cost himself. Mark doesn't just give us these scenes so that you can just admire Jesus and just keep him at an arm's length. He gives this to us to press you toward a response. Because every person in this passage responds to Jesus in some way. Some come to him desperate and honest. Some follow him, but they struggle to understand what are his priorities. Some receive his grace, but they resist his instruction. And the question now turns towards you and I. Again, for some of you, the invitation this morning is very simple and clear. Just like the leper, it's come to Jesus. Like the leper, you may feel unclean this morning. You may have walked into these doors burdened by sin and shame and a sense of distance from God, but you don't have to wait to fix yourself before you come to him. You don't need to wait until you feel worthy. You come because the King is willing and because the King has the authority to make the unclean clean. And today is the day of your repentance. Today is the day to believe the gospel, to trust Jesus Christ as your Savior and Lord and King. For others, the invitation is not to come for the first time, but to submit more fully. Right? You trust Jesus' power, but you've been resisting his direction. You've allowed the urgency of the day, the convenience of comfort, or the fear of those around you to shape your obedience. But the King who heals is also the King who leads. And following him means trusting his mission even when it disrupts our own. And for all of us, church, the invitation is the same at its core. It's trust the King. Trust him with your weakness. Trust him with your direction. Trust him with your obedience. Because the King does not stand at a distance, but he enters into homes. He withdraws to pray. He touches the unclean. And ultimately, he goes to the cross to bear our own exclusion so that we might be brought near. Would you all pray with me?